gentlemen? Excellent. We're webcasting, so we want to make sure we get this thing rolling on time. Well, welcome tonight. We are famous at this program for having weather events every single time we have something. So welcome to fall. We did it for you today. Yes, this is the nonprofit management program here at Columbia University School of Professional Studies, of course. I'm Cindy Lott. I'm the academic director. I'm full-time faculty here as well. This is our fall masterclass this evening, and we are so happy to see all of you here in person. We are also webcasting this event, so we'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us across the country, possibly internationally as well, for this evening's masterclass. So this particular masterclass is yet one more in the series that we have around thought leadership out of this program. The program's been here for about 4 years. We are a master's program. We offer in all sorts of formats and modalities. You can find everything and more that you would want to know about this master's program on the web. We hope, in fact, that you will visit our website. You can also see all sorts of other types of events that we do. This is but one of the events that we do for the public. We open this up to, as we call it, our Columbia community, but it's really anyone who has been attached to this program or supported this program or is interested in this program in any way gets an invitation, and we're happy to have you share those out. So we're here this evening for a particularly wonderful topic. It's a very, very timely topic. It's going to have a number of different strands. You'll see that our guest luminary this evening is Shirley Sagawa. And I'm just going to frame with a few remarks about this and also about Shirley. You can find Shirley's complete bio on our website, so I want to make sure to draw your attention to that, and I will not be reading a whole lot around her bio this evening. But she knows this area well. She has spent an entire professional career devoted to mission-based work, and we are so very honored that she is here for our masterclass this evening. So one of the big issues that we have as we started this program was really there's been a long time philosophical debate in our sector, and as I always say, our sector is embedded in every sector, which is about whether or not this particular work that's mission-based should be, quote, professionalized. And so I talked to a lot of people about this because we're one of the first nonprofit master's degrees, dedicated master's degree to nonprofit management. And we think a lot about this. This sector, as the title states, more than implies, is almost 10% of the workforce in this country. And it's a huge economic driver. Our workforce is an economic driver. The billions of dollars that flow through this sector are extremely important to be handled correctly, to be handled ethically, to be handled in a way that is mission-based. And so many of us feel that it's truly, truly time that we have master's degrees and other types of professional training that, of course, completely devoted to training people to deal with this, but also cross-sectorally. One of the other aspects about having that much in the workforce and with the future of work that I know Shirley's going to be dealing with as well is that people cross the very permeable boundaries now between and among the sectors. We would like to normalize the notion that in your career, you may very well be working in a mission-based environment. In any one of the sectors, you can accomplish a lot. And so this is helping, degrees like what we have. What Shirley's going to be talking about, the research that she has done, is really about how we think about the pipeline, how we think about what that workforce means, and what the policy implications are around that. Typically and historically, we've not had a lot of attention paid when it came to policy in the US at least, thinking about the nonprofit sector, thinking about the workforce. We've seen it over and over. History is replete with examples of us not having been taken into account in legislation and in other thinking policy-wise. And so that's another aspect of what Shirley's going to be talking about this evening. So it's crucial that we recognize the workforce. It's crucial that we recognize that policy should take into account this sector and the workforce and the work that's done. And it's also crucial to help educate people about how to do policy work. And we do a lot of thinking about that in this program as well. We will have a further series that kicks off next month that's actually on policy and advocacy during this entire 15-month election cycle for election 2020. So those are also open to the public, and we very much hope that you'll join us in person or by webcast. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Shirley, and you'll note, if you've looked at her bio, even just the highlights, Shirley remains a visiting senior fellow at Center on American Progress. She was both a Bush and a Clinton appointee. She was Deputy Chief of Staff to Hillary Clinton on policy, and she has helped all through the years that they were first beginning, and I know we've got some other folks in this audience who may have been in that space as well, thinking about how to create the programs around national service, which has essentially served as a pipeline and an apprenticeship for a very, very long time in this country. And we'd like to expand those efforts. So Shirley has done that and much, much more, books that she's written, the research that she's doing. She has worked in all forms of the sector, and we hope she continues her research because it's very, very important. And it's, again, a person to continue watching as we see what she does in the next iteration of her career. So I want to welcome Shirley again. She's going to be speaking this evening, and then I'll come back up here and we will do Q&A. We're also going to be taking questions from the audience that is live webcast. I will have my trusty texting from someone feeding me those questions, and we'll do Q&A until about 8:30, I believe. So welcome, Shirley, and again, so honored to have you here this evening.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this kind of rainy night, and I'm thrilled to have been invited to speak here on a topic that I'm particularly passionate about. Where's my clicker? Okay, so this is a topic. I've spent my career, my whole career in Washington, D.C., so I'm sorry, I'm here from Washington to help you. But I spent about half of it in government and in public policy roles, and about half of it, working largely with nonprofit organizations as a policy and management consultant. And then I've run 2 different nonprofits. The hardest job I have had by far. We're running nonprofits. So, this is a topic that sometimes when you have the benefit of moving back and forth across sectors, you see stuff that other people who've spent their, whole careers in one fairly narrow role you don't see. So a lot of the things I'm researching and talking about now come from that kind of toggle. So, I don't know if you can read this, but it basically says, this came from a list of myths about nonprofits. So number 2 myth is that nonprofits are mainly staffed by volunteers. And obviously that's not true, but you can kind of see why people do think this. When it may be their only interaction with a nonprofit is as a volunteer or because they've been asked to give money. They may interact with nonprofits that they don't understand are nonprofits, like, hospitals or, a variety of services. You don't stop and go, what sector is this? So, it's largely invisible. And there's also the whole thing about not too much overhead, right? You don't want nonprofits to have too much overhead, which I don't agree with, but that is a thing that is obviously out there. So all of that kind of may convince some people that mostly nonprofits are run by volunteers. And it turns out I've actually run into that on Capitol Hill, which is part of the wake-up call for me that we need to do something. So, the good news is that we have, organizations like Independent Sector, this is their chart, not mine, to try to, show how important nonprofits are in our society. And so, this talks about the large number, the 1.6 million organizations, and the donations that are going in, $390 billion, and the time people spend volunteering and what it's worth and how many volunteers there are. So all that's super helpful. These are big numbers. We're all super impressed. The one I want to talk about is the 10%. That 10% of the workforce is employed by nonprofit organizations. And that is something that is not well known, I will tell you, in the policy world that I traffic in. I've done a lot of workforce development policy, worked a lot in education policy. Not gonna register with a lot of people who do that type of work. Really big kudos to the Center for Civil Society Studies at Johns Hopkins, Lester Solomon, who has done he's just been a dog with a bone to get that data out. And so, a lot of what I know came from him, not my research, his. But he really does make a good case, he and his team, about how important it is that the people who are employed in the sector be understood to be employees, that we think about how do we prepare people. Programs like this, we need a lot more. The real, if you think dramatically about every corner of your life where you're going to run into a nonprofit organization that is going to matter to you, and how that is something that we really ought to pay more attention to in every community. One number that's not up there, $2 trillion, which is what nonprofits contribute to the US economy, which is 5.4% of our GDP. And that includes the $826 billion in wages that are paid to people who work at nonprofits. So this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which I thought was a really interesting chart, which kind of shows nonprofit employment as a percentage of total private employment. It's a couple years old because government data is always a couple years old. But if you look at it, you can see what a major industry nonprofits are, especially in these northern states, in a lot of states that have experienced job loss in other sectors. It has become really important. In fact, in 24 states in Washington, D.C., nonprofits actually employ more workers than all branches of manufacturing. And it's a major industry in most states. And a major industry is any industry that accounts for more than 5% of the workforce. And by that measure, the nonprofit sector is a major industry in all but one of the nation's states in the District of Columbia. So that's kind of important. And in more than half of the states, the nonprofit sector accounts for more than 10% of private sector employment. So, that just shows that in many places, and if you go down to the county level, it's even more dramatic. So 77% of the 1,900 counties have nonprofits as a major industry, and yet it's invisible. If you think about like a place like Flint, Michigan, right, which is sort of famous for having lost most of its manufacturing jobs. In fact, still does have GM as its largest employer, but it's at 10%, less than 10% of what it was at its peak. So that's number one. Numbers 2, 3, and 4 employers in Flint, Michigan are nonprofit hospitals. And if you go down, there's 4 universities, some public, some not, government. There is still industry in Flint, but it's become clear that education and healthcare are really just as important to the economy of Flint, Michigan. And I'm sure that's true in many, many other areas. So it's kind of helpful to look at some of you probably know this, like the back of your hand, but in case you're new to it, like what makes up nonprofit employees' employment in the U.S. And you can see that hospitals are a big piece of it. As is education, which is mostly higher education. There's a small percentage of K through 12 schools that are private schools that would be nonprofit. But even if you say, well, wow, that's really skewing the data. If you think about the diversity of the organizations that make up all those little segments, I mean, it's everything from the museum that you go to, the child care center that takes care of your kids, the professional association you belong to. You can go down the list. It's quite a dramatic array of types of organizations that interact with people in their daily lives all the time. So I thought it would be useful to put the nonprofit employment in the context of other industries that get a lot more attention. So nonprofits employ 12 million people, approximately. And if you decided that you didn't want to include hospitals for whatever reason, you're still at 8 million people. So it's still a super big number. And when you look, these numbers are other sectors. Financial services employs 6 million people. Transportation, 5 million. Real estate, 2 million. And agriculture, and we certainly do spend a lot of time worrying about agriculture, 1 million people. So not to comment on the importance or lack of importance of, all these sectors are super important, right? But here we have 8 million people who don't get enough attention, and that's what the purpose of this conversation is. Nonprofit employment now equals manufacturing. I think it's the case that we worry so much about manufacturing because it was the first industry to start feeling both globalization and technology implications. But there's so many other jobs that are affected by these various trends, and it's time that we kind of spoke up on behalf of the ones that we're concerned about here. So you probably can't read this because it's really light, but if you can't read it on the screen, it says invisible. The reason we don't get that attention is because this is the invisible sector. It's amazing to me how big and important the nonprofit sector is, that in the conversations that happen around Washington and undoubtedly in state houses and probably in cities, that this is just not like, people are not sitting there going, I need the nonprofit sector represented here. No, nonprofits are going to be represented if it's about a topic that the nonprofit helps people do. So there's no question that, that if you're having a debate about the future of work, you're probably going to have a workforce development organization at the table to represent how the workforce development organization is going to help manufacturing have workers or retail have workers. They're not there to represent the sector. And there's also been a huge amount of work that the people who do advocate on behalf of the sector have had to do around things like tax policy. That becomes like a real bread and butter issue. Or about things relating to oversight and accountability. And we always hear when there's an organization that has fraud and abuse and things happening that shouldn't happen, and then that's when the sector gets attention. So, but when something like the Affordable Care Act happens, the discussion is about the nonprofits at the table are worried about, like, what's the policy going to be in terms of hospitals being able to get paid and doctors to be able to get paid. They're not there thinking about, I'm here to represent employers that are in the sector. So it was a total afterthought when policymakers were kind of trying to figure that all out to say, oh yeah, nonprofits too. So there's a variety of comparisons we could make, but the one I want to make now is to the world of small business. So the world of small business is bigger. About half of the people in the US actually work in small business. So we're 10%. Small business is bigger. But so they get their own agency, the Small Business Administration. And because they have an agency, they also have committees of the Congress. So they have both a House and Senate committee. And I'm not saying we need to have the same thing, but the result of having this level of attention means issues that affect the small business world get attention. So the House Small Business Committee has, in the last 6 months, has had 30 hearings on topics like spurring innovation, immigration and the small business workforce, apprenticeships, how regulation stifles small business, rising student loan debt and its effect on small medical practices, and expanding opportunities for small business at military bases. And in comparison, the only House committee relating to the nonprofit sector, only hearing that has happened, were one on the tax exemption for organizations engaged in hate speech, and one on public service loan forgiveness. So just to give you like the proportion of attention, and in fact I would argue that potentially at least that first topic is really not about nonprofits at all. There was also a Senate Finance Committee review about whether nonprofit hospitals are meeting their charitable obligations. So that's the conversation that's happening. And you can see how many things are happening in the world, these big topics that could affect nonprofits. Small business is at the table. So here's one reason why this number, 2,217,425,929, is the amount of money that's been spent by small business on lobbying in the last 20 years. And just for comparison purposes, I didn't have time to do a nonprofit calculation. That's like a research topic someone could take up. But the entire combined budgets of independent sector, the National Council of Nonprofits, and the Council on Foundations is about $25 million, a very tiny fraction of which is spent on advocacy. And I'm sure there are others that advocate, but not that many, right? So, proportionality, big issue. There's a famous saying in Washington that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So, passing that on. And so because so many people are concerned about small business, we get stuff like, this is the White House tweeting that the Small Business Healthcare Act became law in North Carolina. So, there's stuff like I could have put a million different things up there. And at the same time, this is a piece from Nonprofit Quarterly, a minimum wage rollback looms, where is the nonprofit employer's voice? So at least somebody's talking about this, but I guarantee you this was not something that really was very present in the debates on minimum wage that are continuing. And these are issues that are continuing to be big issues, right? We're going to keep talking about minimum wage. We're going to keep talking about, what to do about health care access. And so who's representing nonprofits? Which I would say it's not good enough to kind of say, oh, well, small businesses are kind of similar, because they are, but they aren't. I mean, there's very different perspectives that you're going to have if you're a mission-driven, organization by law than if you're a for-profit organization. Now, that's not to say that there's not crossover and that people working in small business don't also sometimes have strong mission commitments, like all good, but they're not the same. And I think it's really important to recognize that. So, a big topic that's coming that I hear about all the time now is future of work. And probably you guys know this, but a lot of times what that really means is a fairly narrow look at what is happening because of the artificial intelligence and automation to jobs largely in manufacturing, right? But in all sectors. So we're all worried about that. Where are these people going to be employed? How do we upskill people? And that's a big, big topic. It's in every business magazine. It's forums in Washington. There's committees that are appointed on this all over. And I did a little scan. I didn't do comprehensive research on this, but future of work conversations do not have, again, nonprofits at the table. It's not the conversation I think needs to get bigger. So what's the future of work going to be when we have a disaster every week? Who is going to be there to help all those people get back on their feet? What's going to happen to nonprofits who are affected by a disaster? Or if you think about, a lot of people are talking about universal early childhood education. Who's going to work in those programs? Or you can think about the aging of just our population. We have 10,000 people turning 65 every day. So, who's going to take care of all these people? And we need to worry about the future of work in the nonprofit sector just as much as we have to worry about what's going to happen to all those people who are losing their jobs because of artificial intelligence. And when we're worried about upskilling people, let's upskill some of them to work in caring positions, in positions that might, really be more meaningful to them. And if you look at what happened in Flint, the industry, manufacturing is declining, but education, healthcare, and others ascending. We should be having a conversation that puts these pieces together, not one over here and one over there. So that's something that is kind of the main point I want to make. The other thing to think about, there really is important to think about what's going to happen with technology and artificial intelligence in our context, and what is that going to mean for our organizations, and whether they can, in fact, compete for the talent that's certainly going to be scarcer than we'd like. So, a lot of times nonprofits are competing with for-profits for talent. And unlike, there is actually some evidence that says they're not actually paying a lot less. So, there's sort of a myth that if you work in a nonprofit, you're going to make a lot less than if you work in a for-profit. So that's actually not the biggest problem. And yes, nonprofits do have the advantage of giving people a mission opportunity, which is appealing to especially millennials. It's all that research, we know that. But if you really unpack it, the problem is going to be that nonprofits don't have the recruitment assets that for-profits have. They don't have campus recruiters. They don't have a whole system to be able to bring on the level of people and identify them. They can't afford headhunters. They can, but they can't, right? So you could do that maybe for your CEO, but there's a lot of positions that are going to need talent. And you don't necessarily know the people who are going to be really good at running your technology system, or thinking about how could artificial intelligence improve the way you're working with homeless families. So those are, as data becomes incredibly important as a way to measure outcomes and to think about how do you allocate resources in a way that'll have the biggest impact, you need people who are good at data. So we need to think about that pipeline in a big way. And what these big numbers up here represent, this is from the Nonprofit HR, which is an organization in Washington that cares about this. 64% represents the percentage of nonprofit organizations that have no talent recruitment strategy at all. And if I had more room, I'd say 56% have no plan to do it. So they don't have it, and they're not going to do it. And 81% refers to the share of nonprofit organizations that have no retention strategy or program. And only 27% are planning to have one. So this is going to be a big problem. It's a big problem now. There's no question, I've most recently left a nonprofit named Service Year Alliance, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But, it is a challenge when you have turnover. It's a challenge to find the right people. We surveyed the field of organizations that we worked with, and many of them said the biggest barrier for them to grow is talent. So there's just no question that this is an important topic. And again, policymakers are not paying attention to it. They don't care because we haven't told them to care. I think they could be persuaded to care. And I'll give you some examples of that later. So actually, let me go back 1 minute. I wanted to say a couple more things about the future of employment. One issue that is coming up is the retirement of baby boomers who work in nonprofits. So a lot of organizations were started by baby boomers when they were young, or they have come to them and they stay. Unlike younger people today who tend to move around more, a lot of baby boomers stayed in their jobs for a really long time. And they are going to leave them one way or the other at some point. And who is going to come in and take those jobs? I have not seen any national numbers. This is a piece of research that would be interesting to do. But there was a study in Western Pennsylvania of a 10-county region which found that nearly 7 in 10 nonprofit executives and more than half of all nonprofit workers plan to leave the sector within 10 years as baby boomers retire. That's a lot of people. So that's just another thing to worry about, right? And why we ought to be paying attention. Because it does matter if we can't get good leaders, if we can't get frontline workers or technologists. That'll matter because these are the organizations that bring us our culture and our health care and our take care of our kids and take care of our aging parents, and will be taking care of us one day. So we worry about all this stuff. So I wanted to just talk about one positive thing that has happened, and then what more could happen, and that's in the context of national service. So the nonprofit workforce is supposed to be about 75% millennials by the year 2025. And a part of the way people now come to work in nonprofits is because they do national service. So this is a slide from Service Year Alliance. I want to give them credit. Right now there's about 66,000 people doing a full year, full-time national service. If you add in the part-time people, you're going to get up somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000. So it's not a million, but it's a good number just to give you a frame of reference. If national service were a university, it would be the 8th largest university in the country. And it basically equals about the size of every if you took all the Ivy League schools entering freshman class and added them together, you're going to get about this number. So it's a big number, but not a big enough number. The biggest funder of national service is a program called AmeriCorps. Who's heard of AmeriCorps? Okay, that's really, who's done AmeriCorps? Okay, it's good. Love to see that. The AmeriCorps is having its 25th anniversary this year. So we just had a really nice party in Washington. And it's an interesting amalgamation of programs. So it ranges from programs that are really targeted at young people who are what I would call opportunity youth, who are disconnected youth is what we used to call people who weren't in school or employed. So there are programs that are very targeted at that group, but there's also programs that are very hard to get into, like the Teach for America would be the example most people are familiar with, but there's a lot of other programs. And then there's plenty of others that are very integrated. So you will find programs that there's a wonderful program I love called Grid Alternatives, which is basically training people to work in solar panel installation. And they have PhDs and they have people who have dropped out of high school, and they all work together doing what makes sense for their level of skill. So it's a very diverse group of programs. And what ties them together is that they're supposed to do three things. And I think that there's good evidence that they mostly do this. So the first is that they let me see if the next slide is, yes, okay. So that they do change the lives of people who serve. So if you serve, you actually develop skills, right? You get those, what some people call soft skills. I've taken to calling them essential workplace skills because, like, why would anybody want a soft skill? And everybody in the workplace, and I don't care which sector you're in, need to communicate, you need to problem solve, you need to be able to, project manage. Like, there's a whole bunch of things that kind of go across all sectors. And you do get a lot of that through the experience. But you also get, connections that will help you. And there's a bunch of studies that have recently been done that show, I think 42% of people who serve in AmeriCorps have gotten the job because of a connection they made there. And 8 out of 10 say it was really valuable to their career advancement. So, there's a fair amount of evidence. Even, some programs actually do provide specific skill developments and the opportunity to get a certificate or something like that. So, there's a program in Maryland where I'm from that does community mediation, and you can get your certificate in mediation, which is a useful thing. So there's plenty of that. So this does change lives, but it also has to do some other stuff too. So it is supposed to solve problems. So you don't have service that isn't really service. It actually has to be organized to make a difference in some way, and it could be, again, a big range. You could be cleaning up building trails in national parks, or you could be teaching digital skills to students, or you could be helping fundraise at an organization, at a nonprofit organization. Big range of, you could be teaching in a school, you could be tutoring in a school, lots of stuff. And then it really does develop leaders and diverse public-spirited leaders and engaged citizens. So good evidence that people develop some kinds of leadership skills that we badly need, like the ability to work with people not like yourself, the ability to get other people to care about a problem and do something about it. Like, those are things that it's hard to name something else that does that. And those are super important skills, not just for the nonprofit sector, but for all of America. So, and there's increasing research that kind of backs up little pieces of this. So Service Year Alliance and Burning Glass Technologies did a study last year that looked at resume. Burning Glass has this massive database of resumes, and so they did a resume study where they found 70,000 people who had done a service year and compared it with 100,000 people who hadn't done a service year but were otherwise matched, and basically found that if you haven't gone to college yet and you do a service year, you're twice as likely not just to go to college but to actually graduate. So a pretty impressive number. And there's studies that show that a large percentage of organizations that have had I think it's Vista. Vista's part of AmeriCorps, but it's very much more about capacity building for nonprofits, that they've actually created jobs for the people who've served there. So it's actually like a job creation engine. And you can kind of see how that would work if you're a nonprofit and you don't have any actual recruitment strategy or plan, and you have a Vista and they turn out to be awesome, you're going to be like, oh yeah, we'll figure out how to keep them. And you do that. So it all makes kind of good sense. So I actually think it became clear to me that the workforce implications of national service are pretty big, and yet not talked about at all. So I always say it was kind of a good thing that when Paul Ryan, about 10 years ago, decided to make a list of all the workforce development programs that the federal government funds in order to show that there were way too many and most of them should be eliminated. It was really good that AmeriCorps was not on that list. But truthfully, it probably should have been, because it is developing workers just not for like manufacturing. It's developing workers for organizations that take care of people and help people learn and help people solve their problems. So I've been using this term civic apprenticeship to refer to national service programs that combine work-based learning and career development with a motivating social purpose, which is different from a traditional workforce development program. And I would say better, because we all know how important motivation is to get people to continue on in any program. Like if you think you're there for no reason, then you're probably going to leave. And if you have, there's actually a fair amount of studies about youth development and lifelong development that say having a sense of purpose is really important to your health and happiness, not to mention pursuing a career and being able to be successful at it. So we want stuff that's going to teach you or help you figure out your purpose. Not everybody's going to find their purpose here. There's other purposes, but this is one way. So I wanted to give an example of a field that's figured this out, which is a lot of these pictures are pictures of disaster response activities. And FEMA, a few years ago, let me back up. Hurricane Katrina, I think most of you probably remember that. It was terrible. And it was a very, the Corporation for National Service sent a lot of people there to help. 40,000 AmeriCorps members served there over a period of 10 years. So there were a lot of people there doing everything from mucking out houses and helping people volunteer, to staying longer to help, basically rebuild the education system from the ground up and take over the nonprofits. People running nonprofits actually left, and so having people there who were, really had come down to like just help for a couple of weeks. Some of them stayed for the rest of their lives and became important civic leaders in that space. So that all happened, and people saw how valuable it was. And it occurred to FEMA, an official at FEMA some years later, that the people who worked at FEMA were kind of aging, and that there was going to be a need to have new people going to work for FEMA, and yet they didn't have a pipeline, because federal government is, if there's one industry that's worse at like creating a pipeline for employment than the nonprofit sector, it's actually the federal government. So they decided to take some of their, quote, no-year money and create a FEMA Corps and ask the Corporation for National Service to run it. And it's not that big, it's about 1,000 people. But every time there's a disaster, this team is deployed. It's a residential program. If any of you have kids or friends who are looking for some adventure, it's a really cool program. It's residential, and you kind of get to go in like the SWAT team and do things like figure out how to set up the system and talk to people who have been affected and get them benefits and mobilize in a whole bunch of interesting ways, learning about the logistics of emergency management. And if in the early years there wasn't such a strong pipeline, but now a really high percentage, more than half of the people who do FEMA Corps go on to careers in emergency management. They may not be at FEMA, they may be in a local or a state or local agency, but they're going on to do this career, and it's a very powerful pathway. And similarly, education has become really high. Again, nobody in education knows this, but it's pretty highly dependent on national service for a couple things. First, AmeriCorps is in basically 1 out of every 4 low-performing schools. And AmeriCorps is actually the largest federal funding stream for nonprofits, flexible federal funding stream for nonprofits working in schools. So that is not sort of well understood. But it's also like this amazing pipeline for people into teaching. And that's not just through their teacher programs, teacher residency programs, and programs, teacher corps. It's about 9,000 people who are in those programs. But the people who just do their year tutoring or do the year doing college advising for kids in low-income schools are really attractive candidates for teaching. So not just, so the schools of education are eager to get them. And somebody who spends a year in a low-income school and dealing with so many of the issues that trauma experience that the young kids have had, and how hard it is sometimes to help people learn when they're dealing with a very chaotic environment. You know, if they can stick it through the year, they're a great candidate to actually stick it through, if they decide to go into teaching afterwards, they become a great candidate. So a lot of the teacher education programs and the teacher corps want to recruit folks who've had that experience. And there's certainly other cases. Like I would think it would be a really interesting study to see the implications of VISTA have had in terms of generating the sort of leadership of the nonprofit sector. 50% of people in VISTA go on to jobs in public service. So, you know, what has happened to them, we don't really know. So there's a lot of data now that you could actually use to figure that out. So this is all a long way of saying, I think national service is an important piece of the pipeline. There's some stuff happening now that leads me to think that we may have this opportunity to see growth. There's a commission in Washington that's working on a plan for what to do about national service, as well as military and public service. That they will be putting out a report in March. I have it on good advice that we will probably like the report, but we don't know, so watch for that. It's coming out in the middle of a presidential campaign. My former organization, Service Year Alliance, has got a Serve America Together challenge that they're partnering with other nonprofits to ask candidates to make national service a priority in their first 100 days. And so far they've gotten 4 candidates to respond and are in conversations with almost every campaign. So, and I will say, I've been doing this for like a really long time, and this is the first time I have seen the kind of energy and excitement on the part of candidates for this topic this early. And a lot of it is coming from anxiety that our country is so divided, and what can we do to bring people together in common purpose, so they're seeing that this is valuable. But it's not just that. They're seeing it as a way to provide more college access by rewarding people who serve. They're seeing it as a way to deal with climate change by creating climate corps. So it's becoming something that candidates are looking at the triple bottom line and saying, this is what we need. So I'm kind of optimistic. But I think it's going to be important if we want to see, if national service is going to grow, is it going to grow in a way that's strategic so that it actually starts filling holes and gaps and creates the pipeline for industries, or is it going to be just kind of something else? So having a seat at the table will be important for the sector. It's also important to think about how agenda setting happens. And you all have an important role in whatever capacity you're here to kind of start amplifying that voice. Again, I'm a big fan of the Johns Hopkins project. They've put this as their most recent report on nonprofit employment. You can get it online. It's got a lot of data in it. So kudos on that, but we really need to see that data getting to policymakers and candidates. And I'm glad you're doing the series that you're doing here. But if you have occasion to be at a town hall and ask a question, think about how you can inject this into the debate, because if it's not being talked about, it's not going to happen. I'm also I've been a little disparaging of people in Washington, but there are some who pay attention to this. So this is a bill that was introduced by Betty McCollum, who is the representative, I think, from St. Paul. Apologies if I got that wrong. But, we worked with her some years ago on a bill to create a sort of a commission on nonprofits, an interagency task force, and it ended up it actually almost passed. But it would be good, so she's reintroduced a new version of it. So there is, she gets it. She's in St. Paul. There's a lot of nonprofits in St. Paul. She gets that. But other members maybe don't know that in their own districts. So how do we get that information out? Also excited to see another good development, and my friend Cynthia Schumann at Aspen Institute had worked on this for years to try to get tax filings of nonprofits to be electronic so that they could become an automatic database that could be used. And they were successful in passing legislation just recently to make that available. So all of a sudden there's like a much bigger database that could be used to learn about the sector and discover things that we would need to know. Programmatic health, make informed, deal with the gaps in the field, think about the impact of nonprofits on employment and the economy. So a lot of people worked on this, a lot of organizations worked on it. It was hard, but it's out there now. And so if there are researchers in the audience, I hope you'll use it. So I'm gonna conclude just with some random thoughts about what an agenda could look like, because that's like the thing I like to do sometimes is figure out, well, okay, I'm complaining about all the stuff, so what's the answer? So just a few ideas. So one is thinking about having some kind of representation in Washington I don't think we want a whole agency. I don't think you're going to get a whole agency, but there ought to be something that's charged with caring about the nonprofit sector in all of its dimensions. I haven't even gone into like procurement issues and how every dollar you get from the government, you have to raise more than that to cover the loss that you're going to have by the government contracts. We're not talking about that today, but that's a topic. Very often there's White Houses will create a White House office like maybe there could be a White House office that cares about this. When I worked for Hillary Clinton, we were that office, kind of. It was informal, but so people knew they could go there and talk about nonprofit issues. But if you don't know where to go, then it's harder. And why there used to, at one point, there was a philanthropy caucus in Congress, but that's gone. It's not on the list now. And so having a caucus could be a way to at least have some go-to people on Capitol Hill who would have to learn about this stuff. What about a nonprofit impact statement when there's a rule created? What about every time somebody creates a government panel and there's not someone there representing unemployment, and there's not somebody there representing nonprofit employers, what if we all threw up a big stink and got somebody on that panel? Or what if there was this is my little pet peeve, is there's just so few programs that directly fund the nonprofits that work in a space. The money tends to go to government or schools. So if you're like a nonprofit that's doing amazing work and turning around schools, it's really hard for you to gain the capital that you would need to scale. So there's just a lot of mechanisms that aren't getting paid attention to because nobody's talking about nonprofits. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say we should be talking about national service at scale and bringing a civic apprenticeship dimension to it. So those are my ideas. I bet you can come up with some even better ideas. And so it's not really about selling ideas, it's selling agenda setting. Let's just let people know, let's let candidates know that this is an important field that needs their attention, and that if they come up with policies in this space, lots of people will take notice because lots of people have a connection, not just working in nonprofits, but volunteering and donating or using them as clients. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I think there might be a slide that says Q&A. Yes, there is, and I'm happy to answer any questions.